Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic podcast. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and once again, Rod's travels have taken him beyond his camera. So I have phoned a friend, as it were, and brought to you, I should say, my good friend, Dr. Larry Chapp.
Yep.
Dr. Larry Chapp, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's great being a stand-in for Rod. I'm a big fan of his.
Yeah, no, it's good. And for those of you who only know me through the General Eclectic podcast, I do some sort of standalone shows on my own channel, the Kale Zeldin podcast. And Dr. Chapp and I have had some great conversations. We tend to hover around things Catholic. So if you could just tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you got here and what you do, Larry.
Well, first off, I'm a Midwestern boy. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, so I'm kind of a blue-collar kid at heart, who just happened to be an egghead nerd and went off to school. And I was in seminary for a while, discerned that wasn't for me, and ended up at Fordham University again, got my doctorate there in 1994. I did my dissertation on Hans Urs von Balthasar
Mm-hmm.
and resource Mont Communio theology in general. Got a job right away in Allentown, Pennsylvania at DeSales University, taught there for 20 years, fully tenured, full professor, and so on, published, did all that sort of stuff. And then grew very, very weary, not of teaching, I still love teaching, but I grew weary of what was becoming of modern higher education. We've talked about this in some other podcasts with you.
Yep.
And I got weary of the whole academic hamster wheel. And and my wife and I both felt called to start a Catholic worker farm with a friend of ours, Father John Gribowich, which we did northwest of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I've been for 8 years. And I've recently suddenly rediscovered my academic roots. I started a blog last year, gaudiumetspes22.com, and Rod Dreher was kind enough to even post some things on his blog from mine and helped it take off. And now, all of a sudden, people want to talk to me, uh, which I find strange, but I have an
Well,
opinion. I have
well,
an opinion in a minute, so that's good.
yeah, no, the opinions fly pretty fast, which is fun. Which is, I'm detecting a pattern here. Rod, we're all friends here, and Rod will find these things and sort of blow it up, and then expands out my own sort of sphere of friends and influences, and so you have been part of that. So it's been
Yeah.
great here. But I look at your sort of near decade long retreat to your farm. I think clearly it has been a productive sort of retreat for you. It's almost sort of Cincinnatus-like that you've sort of gone away and tended to your farm, and
Yep.
you have that kind of inner compulsion because you and I, just before we started recording here, we're both sort of talking about we've obviously, both of us have read a ton in both our professional careers and personal lives. And people like the two of us, we don't stop seeing things. And so I wonder, if that 8-year retreat to the farm has been productive in that way.
Yes, it did. I mean, because I didn't stop reading
Yeah.
and I didn't stop thinking about things and I didn't stop praying. We have a small chapel on
Hmm.
our farm, and we've got a lot of visitors to the farm where we would sit around and talk about, big ideas,
Yeah.
and just it really allowed me to read things that I wanted to read, not for publication, not for
Yeah.
scholarly things, but for my own spiritual and intellectual growth. And man,
Hmm.
that was really liberating to just sit
Mm.
down and say, I'm going to read this book, and to heck with whether or not it's of any value in the publication world. And yeah, and then eventually, after numerous people said, "Hey, chap, you talk some stuff." I use strong language, but you talk some stuff, and maybe you should start a blog. And I said, everybody blogs for crying out loud.
Who doesn't have a blog, right, Ron?
It's
You know.
great to have a few blogs you go to, like Rod's and
Yeah. Yeah.
Steve Skojak. I love his blog,
Yeah.
his stuff. He's great
Yeah.
and honest. And what Rod and Steve have in common is just a brutal honesty, which.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my wife said to me when I started mine, just write if you have something to say, period, and a discussion. And so I try to be just as honest. I don't kowtow to anybody. And so yeah, the 8 years was very instrumental in me sort of developing an intellectual voice that was independent, but not oriented towards the academic sphere.
It's funny. I just got finished reading a book by Alan Jacobs called The Narnian, which is a sort of an intellectual biography of C.S. Lewis. And it's funny because Lewis was a real gifted tutor, in the Oxford system, but he really hated the work, and he found it to be complete drudgery, which is shocking because all of his students, loved him. And he was a magnificent lecturer, and he was incredibly productive. But I don't know about you, but was your experience of teaching in a weird way? Did it sort of distract you from your own work? Do you think intellectually?
Well, in some ways, yes, and in other ways, no. I know
Okay.
that's an evasive answer, but there I was trying to, publish a lot of things in the Communio School of Theology, and I did. And so when you're talking Balthasarian and De Lubacian and
Yeah.
Ratzingerian Trinitarian ontology, it's not something that easily translated into teaching
Right.
undergraduates, which is what I
Right.
taught undergraduates. And so, yeah, there was a tension there, especially DeSales had a 4 course a semester teaching load,
Yeah.
about 35
Wow.
kids a class. So it was busy. On the other hand, boy, I tell you, I loved teaching undergraduates,
Yeah.
and they forced me to, in a sense, come out of the clouds and stop
Yeah.
writing and focusing on writing things that only 100 people in the world could understand or would even bother to read. And so, yeah, over those 20 years, I developed a certain skill set for communicating
Yeah.
with just sort of a broad cross section of young people. I was good at it. I'll just toot my own horn. I was
Yeah.
very, very good at teaching undergraduates. And so I think that is now translated into my blog and other things I'm writing now, where I just finally decided, you know what, I'm going to take what I learned from teaching undergraduates and apply
Mhm.
it to the social media sphere, let's put it that way. So in
Yeah.
that way, teaching undergraduates was not a distraction at all. It was
Yeah.
an excellent preparation.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think it's a preparation. I teach high school. I love teaching high school. I mean, the classroom, is just such a place of vitality for me. But one must, of course, take advantage of those opportunities when your students are not in front of you to be productive. And maybe at another time, I can ask you for some advice on how to be most productive, especially in terms of the writing. But I love this notion that you're talking about. You have your high academic work, kind of in the cloud stuff, and you have to bring it back down into reality. Which I'm going to make a cheap segue here. One of the what I wanted to talk with you today was a piece published in First Things by Ross Douthat, of course, New York Times columnist and author and friend of the podcast, it should be pointed out. And the name of the piece is Catholic Ideas and Catholic Realities. That's the title that was given the piece in First Things. And I think that's operative here. You talk about ideas and realities, and how do you make idea and reality sort of interact with one another. And maybe that's in part what your work has been for you, to sort of take this level of idea and take it back down to the level of the real.
Yeah, yeah,
Those of you who watch my show here with Rod and my other podcasts, of course, with you and others, Larry, know that I really like to talk about that idea of the real, that it really must ideas have to be made incarnate or enfleshed. And so, at any rate, let's dive into this piece by Douthat. He starts off by saying this line: "For the last 50 years, from the Second Vatican Council onward, it made sense to speak of an American Catholicism fully reconciled to liberal democracy." And indeed, Larry, for our adult lives, we have lived in the post-Vatican II world, right? Which is the prevailing assumption is that there was a cozy and frictionless relationship between church and state. Of course, the great articulator of that is John Courtney Murray. And his thing, but before we sort of get into this reconciled to liberal democracy idea, why was there a need for a reconcilement in the first place? I mean, again, for us, for our audience, we've always lived in this period of reconcilement, but what was it like before?
Well, the fact is that Rome, the papacy, the Vatican, remained very Eurocentric in its vision of
Hmm.
things and
Hmm.
really didn't concern itself a whole lot with America, despite its growing economic power
Hmm.
and influence in the world, because Rome kind of thought America was sort of a backwater, still missionary immigrant territory for Catholics, and that the real intellectual mojo, baby, was in Europe. And so in the 19th century, Pope Gregory published various condemnations of democracy, and it was really focused towards Europe and the kind of democracy that was emerging in Europe. And the kind of democracy that was emerging there was very anti-clerical, very
Right.
anti-Catholic. I mean, look at France. I mean, the officially secular state and so
Right.
on. And so there was,
And of course the surrounding Italian nation state
oh,
that was formed
yeah,
in the late
days
in
of Italian nationalism and
right.
some which cut Vatican I short
Yeah.
and so on.
Which is
And
but by the way, which is such an interesting historical moment for Vatican One and that reality. But anyway, I don't want to get us sidetracked here, but please go
And
ahead.
so, Americanism, as the Rome was calling it, was too easily associated with and lumped in with that sort of general European movement towards a kind of anti-Catholic secularism as the root of modern liberal democracy.
Hmm.
And the Pope
Hmm.
was, in fact, right to sort of condemn the religious indifferentism, the religious relativism, the secularism that it instilled, a fundamentally materialist view of human existence,
Hmm.
putting economics before all else, and
Right.
so on. And so it
Well,
didn't
and I would
well
just say,
American.
that liberal democracy is also being a primary practical driver of modernism. And that word modernism, of
Yeah,
course, it really depends upon what context you're using that word. But for most people, for the lay ear, modernism sort of means like, well, it's what's now. It's like it's what's new.
yeah.
In the theological context, it's a slightly different thing, right? So why would they have been concerned that liberal democracy would have been driving modernism forward? I mean, isn't modernism a good thing?
Well, in some ways, yeah, some ways no. But the fact is, modernism as a theological movement is very diffuse. But
Hmm.
in the thing that most concerned Rome was modernism's tendency to say that there's really no stable truth. The dogmas of the faith are true to an extent, but they have to be historically
Ah,
contextualized. And as history unfolds, it's possible perhaps for dogmas to be eclipsed or surpassed or modified somewhat. So there was this general concept of fluidity with regard to
mhm.
now. Obviously, there's a historical element in all dogmas, and the church has always recognized that.
Right,
But there was a real emphasis on that in modernism, that there's
right.
got to be this fluidity in truth. And Rome saw in that and a subjective sort of appropriate. Rome saw that as subjectivism, relativism, historicism,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
rightly sort of reject it. And I think it was a little throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's the problem. And this
Right.
whole condemnation that of modernism and Americanism and democracy made Catholicism very suspicious to most Americans as
Right.
these Irish and Italian and German and Eastern European immigrants started flooding our borders. You saw the rise of anti Catholicism, nativism, know nothingism in the United States, which is why it was such a huge deal when John Kennedy got elected president. But he basically had to disavow his Catholicism in order to do so in his famous
Right.
speech to the Baptists in Houston.
In Houston, that's right. It's true. It's interesting that even in the mid-century, when the main line, so to speak, as the WASP main line becomes sort of thoroughly American and maybe less Christian, at least anyway, in a real way. It's such a fascinating period of time. This mid-century moment, that leads that culminates on some level with the election of John F. Kennedy, right? And I think you're
Yeah,
exactly right to point this out. So, right, at that election point, what, 18 months later, the Pope announces that they're going to convene a council. So it's
correct.
such a fascinating that mid-century moment. I've really been reading a lot lately
Yeah,
about this mid-century moment. So it's a strange confluence of a kind of new opening up Catholicism, and of course the emergence of the United States of America out of the war into sort of its ascendancy, and of course the immediate movement into the Cold War.
Yes, the fact is, yeah, that the bishops in the United States before World War II, their number one concern was assimilating Catholics into broader
Mm-hmm.
American culture. So they
Mm-hmm.
didn't want this adversarial relationship, and so they would go out of their way to try and emphasize, no, no, no. Yes, we have allegiance to the Pope, but we are also
But
patriotic Americans. We
right,
really are people. We're your neighbors. And that still didn't sit well. I mean, there were Supreme Court justices that were, very anti-Catholic.
right.
World War II changed that.
It really did. It
It really
really did.
did. And it became very clear Catholics were patriots just like anybody else.
Yeah.
Rome was, you could tell, was on the side of the Allies, and
Mm-hmm.
this made Americans more. Oh, and then, of course, the great economic boom in the post-war era allowed
Right.
Catholics, GI Bill Catholics, regular Catholics, to enter into that great affluence in middle and expansion of the middle class in America,
Mm-hmm.
so that Catholics became suburban. They moved out of the cities and they
Mm-hmm.
started moving into the suburbs, and they just sort of blended in to the
Right.
broader culture. And at that time, that was viewed to be, hey, this is great. We're now Americans. But nobody really sat back and stopped to think maybe there's a downside to this.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right.
Maybe it's
What?
actually not a good thing if Catholics don't look any different than anybody else. Maybe we're supposed to look a little different from everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And into that mix comes John Courtney Murray, writes his book, We Hold These Truths, in the early 60s, right at this Kennedy moment, this Pope John the 23rd moment.
Right.
I mean, and he makes the famous argument that, in a sense, America has always been a sort of crypto Catholic country
Yeah.
because our constitutional principles are rooted in English common law. And English common law is itself rooted in basically a medieval philosophical matrix,
That's
a
right.
Thomistic matrix. And so the gravamen of John Courtney Murray's argument is that America's principles are essentially Thomistic ones.
Mm-hmm.
Catholics are therefore not only at home in America, we are really at home in America. And so, long before Richard John Newhouse started talking about the Catholic moment in America, Murray was talking about this too. People were saying, well, wait a minute, what about the disestablishment of religion in our
Mm-hmm.
Constitution? Aren't we as Catholics supposed to believe in confessional states and so on? Isn't there an implied doctrine towards religion contained in the First Amendment? And Murray said, no, those are not articles of faith. The First Amendment is not an article of faith. It's not something we have to reject on theological grounds. They're articles of peace. They're just creating a classic liberal argument. We're just creating a level playing field, a neutral matrix in which
Mm-hmm.
all religions can compete. And Catholics can not only compete, we can compete well because America is, in its principles, Catholic.
Well, what's interesting to me, that even a consequential figure like Martin Luther King, in his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, essentially recalls the country to its Thomistic foundings.
Yeah,
It's a fascinating bridge moment there that the promissory note, of course, that he talks about later on, is essentially Thomistic and even Augustinian in its foundations. So I think there's some there. I know that later on we're going to talk a little bit about integralists and
yeah,
tradinistas and benedictines and populists, but there is some there, and I think that Murray sort of comes in this pivotal moment that makes it kind of okay. It makes to the sort of the WASP establishment that it's okay for Catholics to be Americans, and then it makes the same argument to Catholics, saying Catholics, it's okay for you to be Americans.
yeah,
It's sort of this interesting moment, not without its, as you allude to here, not without its complications.
yeah,
These downstream complications that maybe we're living in right now. That kind of triumphant coziness and reconcilement of the mid-century has yielded, I think, now, in the 21st century, there's some frayings of that treaty, so to speak. So
yeah,
anyway, in the piece, Ross talks about that even though that there are these differences between what he sort of calls commonweal Catholicism and first things Catholicism, Joe Biden Catholicism, and who does he use? I don't know.
Paul Ryan, perhaps.
Paul Ryan, Catholicism, which
Yeah,
I quibble with that, but fine. This is his piece. It's not mine. But that there's still some substantial commonalities. Both of these camps, these kind of Commonweal Catholics and First Thing Catholics, granted the harmony between, they took for granted the harmony between their interpretation of post-Vatican II Catholicism and their interpretations of the liberal order. They differed most substantially in whether after the sexual revolution and the rise of neoliberal economics, the leftward or rightward sort of liberalism had gone more dramatically astray. And I think what both camps are struggling to deal with is this acceleration of secularism.
Oh, yes, that's. I want to be clear too. I don't agree with Murray's analysis of the Constitution.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm more in the David Schindler camp that
yeah,
says, there's some metaphysical issues there. But anyway,
yeah,
be that as it may, he was influential. So
yeah,
First Things versus Commonweal, yeah. I'm 62 years old. I came of age in the 60s and the 70s, and
yeah,
and it really is true that most people have a really hard time transcending political categories when they analyze the Christian faith. Because the Christian faith is incarnated in a political order in some ways, and we have to influence the political order, there's a natural tendency to say we have to be players here, and we can't be ideologues, and we can't be purists, so we have to reach these pragmatic compromises. But how do you reach a pragmatic compromise when the liberal political wing of America
hmm,
moves more and more and more in the direction of a kind of practical atheism, a
right,
radical secularism, and
right,
you get the complete radical redefining of human nature as such, transgenderism, the
hmm,
LGBTQ steamroller,
hmm,
forcing of everyone to fit into that mold. And so, abortion on demand. And so you get the whole Biden thing. And what does
hmm,
Biden's caught in a bind because his base is increasingly radicalized in that direction. So
yeah.
he has to, bow to them and worship that end of things to get elected. But I do wonder to what extent he's entirely comfortable with it. And then,
I
of
do
course,
too. I do too. And to be fair to him, I think Biden is a man of his time and a man of his context. And I think that coziness of that mid-century détente between the liberal order and Catholicism, he's a product of that, and in many ways, a kind of was a driver and a force of that coziness really throughout his entire career. And
yeah,
so while I certainly have my personal quibbles with his policy prescriptions
yes.
and his basic positionality, I'm sure on some level he must be looking around and being like, well, wait a second, what do you mean? What do you mean this is controversial? And and I know this is sort of my favorite thing to go after, but I think that this is a result of poor, yeah, poor leadership, poor mentorship. I mean, why is this? Why is this in 2021 coming as a surprise to President Joe Biden that some of his pet positions are problematic? And then how much of his own pragmatism has left him to this point where the Overton window has shifted so far left
Yeah.
by polling data, right? I mean, I'm sure you saw that piece last week. The left really has moved left, and so he's sort of in this. He was sort of put forward as a kind of normie guy, but he's sitting on top of a party that has moved significantly left.
Yeah, and he is a product of his time, and that's very clear. He bought hook, line, and sinker into that compromise with American democracy that essentially meant you had to privatize your faith. So
Right.
you had this notion that, okay, my faith is personal, this personalizing of faith, which has never been central to Catholicism, where my faith has no public cachet, it has no public warrant. It's just something utterly private in the area of worship, and my
It's a
public
it's
are,
an
are
there's an irony there. It's a sort of a kind of neo-Protestantism, actually,
well, it is.
or a caricature of Protestantism, perhaps. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and so he was also, remember this, the 60s and 70s also saw the rise of great theological dissent within the Catholic
Right,
Church on the
right,
liberal wing of things, especially after Humanae Vitae and stuff. And so
sure,
there were moral theologians out there who were counseling the Ted Kennedys, the Joe
yeah,
Bidens of the world, and saying to them, guys like Richard McCormick and Joe Curran, guys like this saying, you can be pro-choice
yeah,
on these issues. You can be, and here's how.
Yeah.
And Mario Cuomo fit into that school of thought too, and that was deeply the Kennedy, Cuomo, Biden sort of wing of the Democratic Party. Those Catholics were being given some really terrible theological advice. So, but the point is, in their
Yeah.
conscience, to
Yeah.
come back to
Yeah.
the main point,
Yeah.
in their conscience, they're not doing anything wrong.
Right. Right.
They personally oppose abortion, but then I'm going to promote it as a public official
Right.
because I've been told by very prominent Catholic theologians that I can do that. And so now all of a sudden, the bishops are coming out and saying, no, you shouldn't do that. And here's why. And there's this blowback now. And I can sympathize with it to an extent. I blogged
Mhm.
about this a little bit on my blog about Eucharistic incoherence.
Yeah.
The bishops have let the horses out of the barn door for 50 or 60 years. And now all of a sudden they want to close the barn, call the horses back in and close the barn door. It's a little late for that in some ways.
It's also
But
just
I guess you could say
it's a
better late than never. But
but it's a
'cause-
refusal to recognize that the way that the world actually works. I mean, you
yeah.
can't simply pretend that you didn't let the horses out, and then you're going to get sort of crabby about the horses being out. I mean, like, well, whose fault is that?
Yeah, it's theirs.
Right. I mean,
Partly theirs. And it's a product, once again, of American bishops after the council coming home and saying, now the council fully endorses liberal democracy. The council endorses, American style freedom of religion and so on. And
yeah,
they went about the business of even hyper assimilating to American culture,
yeah,
believing that Vatican II greenlighted all of that. And
yeah.
so they were extremely reluctant to suddenly engage in all of these anathemas and condemnations and excommunications, which they thought was just part of a past era that we had gotten beyond. And in some ways, there's some merit in the idea that anathemas maybe are not the path of today. Uh, but some things are so fundamental, like the dignity of human life. We are
Yeah.
talking about prenatal homicide here. Uh,
Right,
that
because the question is, well, what is then? What is actually important? If that's not important, what is?
Well, that's what I said in my blog. I said,
Yeah.
if that's not important, then if we can't deny someone communion because they believe in legalized, prenatal homicide and even infanticide, I
Mhm.
mean, then what can we be serious, about? And I sort of jokingly poke fun at a few bishops and say, well, maybe if I parked in Cardinal Supich's parking stall at his chancery, maybe I'd get excommunicated for that or something like that. But
That's right. So again, for our audience's sake, Cardinal Supich is he a cardinal? He's a cardinal archbishop, I believe, of Chicago,
yeah,
and a Pope Francis favorite. In fact, there's all kinds of rumors that he's going to be called to Rome to be in some sort of high up muckety muck position there. But he is certainly a representative of what we might call that old fashioned
yes,
Cuomo Biden wing of Catholicism. But Douthat's point here in the piece is that kind of simple dynamic doesn't quite capture what is going on in the church and therefore what is going on in the world insofar as the church is interacting with the world. And so what he's saying is that amongst a sort of the Catholic writers, the Catholic intelligentsia, which are consequential, it does have downstream effects.
yeah,
Is that there are these groups that are emerging that are quite dissatisfied with that simple commonweal or quote unquote commonweal or first things version of Catholicism, and so he lays out in the piece that there are four emergent groups, and I do think it's interesting that they are emergent, right? That this is not necessarily something that is coming from the hierarchy and emanating down from the hierarchy, but rather this is sort of the messy ferment that it's kind of trickling up from basically from the laity, I guess is
yes,
how you
it
would
is.
say it. But so he talks about populists, he talks about integralists, he talks about the Benedictines, and he talks about the tradinistas. And these are sort of, nothing perfect or etched in stone here. But I'm wondering, what do you think of the taxonomy, Larry? How do you understand it, and do you think
Well,
it captures something?
I think it is a decent taxonomy, a decent, typology of things. But I mean, Ross would be the first one to admit that anytime you do typologies, you run into trouble. Too easy descriptions of movement. As he himself in the essay says, the article says, these categories are fluid and they overlap. So that's
Yeah.
his way of saying, these are useful typologies, but remember, typologies are not a complete explanation of what's really happening. And before I go on, I want to
Yeah.
point out too,
Yeah.
with regard to first things, I have equally strong feelings about the incorrect assimilation to the American way of life that the first thing neocon movement represented as well.
Yeah.
A too comfortable relationship with American corporate capitalism,
That's
a
right.
too comfortable relationship with American militarism and our bloated defense budget and the military industrial complex, uh, a too close association simply with the corridors of American power,
Hmm.
and not enough of a prophetic critique. I think the liberals are better at this. Not
Yeah.
enough of a prophetic critique of the fact that there are some things from the right Catholics cannot engage in, and what we see too in terms of the increasing secularization and why this is falling apart is that after Trump, and maybe Trump simply catalyzed something that was already there. I mean, it's getting the far right is getting scary.
Yeah.
As they call the alt right, which is very not Christian. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, self-professedly so. I mean,
and
like this is,
absolutely that they're
yeah.
not at all about a theocrat project. That
Hmm.
they're
Hmm.
radical libertarians, anarchists, these sorts of things, in
Hmm.
anarchy in a bad way,
Hmm.
and oftentimes quite racist and
Correct.
xenophobic. I know those are easy terms to apply, but from where I sit, it does seem that their nationalism, their populism is tainted with a certain xenophobic attitude and racism.
Sure.
But anyway, those categories are good ones, and we can talk about them, always keeping in mind that typologies limp.
Well, right. I mean, typology it's a map. It's not the terrain, and one must
Right?
always recognize that. Again, notice this sort of back and forth that you and I keep playing with. The idea and the real, and you can't mistake one for the other. Although the idea helps you understand the real, you can't fall in love too much with your map. You can't fall in love too much
And Ross
with your ideas.
and Douthat points this out. He says, at some point we need to recognize that intellectual sphere, though influential, is really up here in the ether,
Hmm.
where people are talking to one another, and we need to understand that the great bulk of people down here
Good. Yeah. Okay. Good.
are
Yeah.
really, really in that world of ideas.
Yeah, right, right, right. And I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why it's a pretty lengthy essay, and I think it's based on a speech, a talk that he gave at the
University
University
of
of
Dallas.
Dallas,
Yeah.
a few months back. But I think so the taxonomy is fine, and just roughly speaking, populism, is a sort of a reworking of trade policies and these kind of things, and it's a kind of a nationalism and more of a localism as opposed to an internationalism, neocon type position. The integralists are, their project is to sort of reclaim a kind of triumphant legislating Catholicism or something
Yeah.
like that. And again, I don't want to straw man these positions. I'm just trying to give us a quick take on them. The Benedictines, of course, named after Rod's Benedict option book, which is sort of a retreat into small local communities, sort of to draw your strength and to build your strength out that way, strength of faith communities, etc. And then the tradinistas are kind of an attempt to reclaim a kind of Christian socialism as a reprieve against the rapacious and dehumanizing aspects of capitalism. Now, I myself have sympathies with all of the positions insofar as I'm a
Yeah.
Catholic,
Yeah. Absolutely.
and they all seem to hit on some true thing. The question, of course, is, you know, if somebody is 100% of something, right? What percentage of integralist am I? What percentage of Benedictine am I? What percentage of Tradinista am I? Right? I mean, so you can kind of play that sort of game here, and I think it certainly does capture some intellectual energy out there, right, with these Catholic thinkers. But I think that's not even really the interesting part of the piece. It is always helpful to sort of get a sense of the landscape. And even the group like the tradinistas, in which I'm very unsympathetic to communism or Marxism or socialism, they do properly recognize the dehumanizing potentialities of capitalism. The dehumanizing and the ways in which that feeds, as you and I have talked about in other podcasts, this sort of comfortable bourgeois accommodationism of let me
Yes.
just get more stuff, right? So I think the tradinistas, I think they're such an important and, yes, I'll say prophetic voice insofar as they're pointing out, guys, like all of this excess, all of this surplus, all of this wealth that we have, it might not be the good thing you think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have great sympathy with the Tradinistas and their critique of Catholicism. And after all, I'm a big devotee of Dorothy Day,
Right.
Peter Morin, and they were hypercritical of capitalism in its American iteration. I mean, we have to be careful throwing the word capitalism around too. It can mean a lot of different things. If it just means market freedom, oh, I'm not opposed to that. But if it means what it has come to mean in corporate America, then there's a huge issue with it. And so, as a Dorothy Day devotee, I'm going to say, Tradinistas, you're right. But Dorothy
Yeah.
Day also opposed socialism. My
Right.
God, Dorothy Day opposed Social Security because she
Right.
thought it invested too much power in the hands of the government.
Right.
And therefore, I'm very cautious. I think one of the things, though, about Biden, to go back to him and
Hmm.
so on, why many bishops and current Catholic worker movement are sympathetic is because they view, in some ways, the Democratic Party through this lens of a criticism of capitalism. Unfortunately, there needs to be a greater criticism as well of the Leviathan of the
Right.
modern state.
Right.
And that the thing that strikes me the most is how frequently, how deeply, and how often our government lies to us,
Hmm.
constantly lies to us, surveils us. And so I don't
And
see
we and
enough.
we've lived through that, and we've lived through that in the last 18 months. I mean,
Oh
we've
yeah,
seen it in
and
spades. Yeah.
so I don't understand all of a sudden this blithe sort of trust in the American government that it's going to, once it destroys or transforms, let's put it that way, our capitalist economy into something more personalist, something more localist. I don't trust that all that power is just going to evaporate. And so that would be my critique of the Tradinistas in that regard from a Catholic worker perspective. That no, don't go down that road of socialism, as the only answer to capitalism. It's just one big state solution to a big economy problem.
Right. And again, Douthat, sort of lays all this out. And he says, look, this is largely, the people who have these kind of debates, between the populists and the integralists, the benedictines and the tradinistas, he says, quote, but most of the people having these debates are somewhat overeducated, and there are no self-consciously post-liberal cadres among the working classes as yet, no mass movement equivalent to the role the pro-life movement played in defining conservative Catholicism in the 1970s. And so, in other words, this is sort of like happening at the level of Twitter, if you'll allow that, and then the necessary articles that then will feed Twitter wars and whatnot. But it is all kind of taking place in the middle of what he correctly reminds us of widespread cultural collapse, right?
Yeah,
So all of this conversation is happening in the realm of ideas. Meanwhile, in the real world, we are seeing a complete and almost total civilizational and structural collapse of the institutions animate civilization. And so he says, guys, while we're busy sort of talking about these ideas, Catholicism in the flesh, right? The lived Catholicism, at least certainly in the United States of America, that kind of parish model, diocesan model, neighborhood model is done.
sure is. We could have a whole show just on the problems faced by modern parishes and
Right.
why they're not really rising to the task at hand. But to the point that most American Catholics, the vast majority of American Catholics, simply don't think in these categories.
Right.
They think in completely modern Americanist categories, ways of thinking, and they'll differ in politics, liberal, conservative, moderate, whatever you want to call it. But most of them would view these debates as esoteric and arcane and having absolutely nothing to do with their lives. And that does relate to the problem of our parishes, because I think, as Bishop Barron calls it, the beige Catholicism of most
Yeah.
modern parishes does not supply us with a counterweight to
Right.
that general disregard for intellectual ideas.
So if we use the Catholic Church, I mean, obviously our audience here is not just Catholic, and so I'm not trying to sort of make this special case, but I do think that Catholicism serves as a kind of model for this widespread structural collapse. I mean, again, talking in some generalities, but pre '60s, Catholicism was a thick Catholicism. It was a thick community structure. There was definitely authority that sort of went all the way up to the parish, to the good Monsignor, and he had real power and real authority. And it was consequential. Whether whether you and I sort of look back at that and say that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's not the point. The point is that it was a consequential, thick community. And so you had children and you sent the children to the Catholic schools, and they went through the sacraments, and they got the sacraments, and then they got married, and then they had kids, and there was a very clear script that we were to follow, and there was an embedded wisdom in that of course we've gotten rid of at our own peril. But the thing that strikes me, and that he points out, he says that we have yet to really deal with this structural collapse of these structures. And he said that the number that struck me, first communions and confirmations follow a similar pattern, with a falling off from baptism in each case. 1 in 5 baptized Catholics do not receive First Communion. 2 in 5 are not confirmed. And 85% of confirmed Catholics aren't practicing their faith by age 21.
Yeah,
I don't know about you, Larry. I sort of knew that, but man, it is so stark to see that number. 85% of Catholics who've gone through the confirmation process, and if you've had kids, you know that this is it's not an easy thing to do. So 85% of those people are no longer practicing Catholics.
because the confirmation process is so atomized, so disengaged from the
Sure.
broader. It's part of the parish not being a counterweight to the dominant culture. Confirmation class is just a hoop I have to jump through for my parents, and I get done with it, and then I'm just going to, once I'm emancipated, I'm not going to practice this anymore because it has no meaning in my life, none, zero.
So right. Yeah, keep going. I want to click. I'm going to latch onto that word meaning in a minute, because I think that's important.
There was always too this feeling. I certainly shared it for a while that, well, the problem is liberals and bad catechesis and blah blah. We just need to hold on to orthodoxy and be conservative and
Right.
orthodox in our theology. But what we see is, that's not true. Uh,
Right.
for a long time,
Say that again. Say that again. I think that's an important point to drive home, because I used to say the same thing, a decade ago.
Yeah, you can't just fly over a Catholic neighborhood and dump 10,000 catechisms out the back end into people's backyards, and then, oh, read this and everything's going to be cool. And it's not. A lot of us would point to evangelical Protestantism and say, see, there's the model. They're holding on to a strong Orthodox form of Protestant Christianity, and they're thriving, they're booming. Whereas the liberal Protestant denominations are dying off. Well, guess what? Those conservative evangelicals are now hemorrhaging young people too,
Exactly.
and their biblicism and their Trumpism and their Americanism and patriotism and all that stuff, where they've waved the flag in one hand and the Bible in another.
Right.
Young people aren't buying that gig no
Right.
more, and they're walking away in droves saying, no,
Right.
we're not doing it. So there is no attack. The problem is, whether you're talking conservative evangelicals or conservative Catholicism, there's still a deep disconnect in the meaning of their lives and the broader faith. The fact of the matter is this: they simply don't believe anymore. They
Right.
stopped believing.
Say that again. They simply don't believe. And like, my question, to you, me, others, like, what does it mean to believe in something? I mean, I, I
Yeah.
hesitate to sound like I'm being trite or obvious, but really, like, what does it mean to believe, to have faith in something?
Well, obviously, in the full, robust sense of a genuine, transformative, healthy Christian faith, it means that all of your affective and intellectual and moral structures are completely informed by the rhythms and cadences of your faith. It orients your life. It's your bell cow. It is your barometer. It's everything.
Mhm.
And we all know, intentional Christians, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, whatever, who are like this and so on. That's in a fulsome, robust sense. Then everybody else sort of falls below that spectrum, right?
Right,
And it's a kind of weird faith that is a kind of unfaith at the same time.
right.
It's a half-hearted faith. I often say it's a sort of degraded version of Pascal's wager, where
Oh, that's interesting. Break that down. That's interesting. What do you mean
well,
by that?
basically, it's the idea, well, I don't know if God exists. I'm not going to completely orient my life around all that gobbledygook. After all, I got to be real. I got to live in the real world. But, I'm going to hedge my bets here because I do hope there's an afterlife. I kind of hope death
Mhm.
isn't the end. I kind of hope
Yep.
there is a God. So you buy into moralistic therapeutic deism as your moral guide and your vision of God. And you sort of live a life of complete Americanism, but you're going to go to church and
Right.
you're going to
Okay.
give the kids the sacraments
So,
because you're hedging your bets. Well, there might be a God, and I hope there is, so I'm going to do this.
so, so, is this an overemphasis on orthodoxy, small o orthodoxy, like right belief, and a complete negligence of orthopraxy, like right practice?
Yes, orthodoxy when I mean, obviously orthodoxy is important. I've wrote
Yeah,
about.
you and I, of course, live and breathe in that, but
I did.
there's something about this fixation on thought.
Yes, that's the problem. Ideas have consequences, so you have to attend to them.
Yeah,
However, if your whole focus is simply on, do you believe these proper doctrines? What's
hmm,
your view of Arianism and so on?
sure,
You're missing
sure.
the whole affective sphere that really moves most people. In fact, it's what moves even most intellectuals on a day to day basis, the affective sphere. And it is that affective sphere, and I don't mean, I'm okay, you're okay sentimentalism. I
Right.
mean a real phenomenological proper understanding of the deep role that human subjectivity and its cultural conditionings plays in the decisions we make on how to orient our lives and the substance of our faith. And the church has not, Protestant or Catholic, paid enough attention to this deep, deep subjectivity and affective sphere, which is why when you come at people and you evangelize them, if your attitude is simply apologetics, going to get the
Yeah.
doctrines right, catechism, you're going to fail and you're going to fail miserably. You have
Yeah.
to engage people. You have to engage people in the totality of their personhood. And sometimes that means establishing cross cross fertilizing networks of communication that might leave you in a bit of tension and in a bit
Yeah.
of suspension.
Yeah. It's so, again, it's so funny. We talk about, our faith, Christianity, of course, being the good news, right? That, and yet we seem so easily distracted from, like, well, what exactly is good about the, the good
Yeah.
news,
Oh yeah.
because if you're being moved, compelled, if you're being drawn, uh, in out of something and into something new, like it's good, right? That's the good news part of it.
Yes.
I'm struck as you were talking here. I'm reminded of Jonathan Haidt's notion of the elephant and the rider, and the
Oh
rider is sort of the rational thing on top of the big, huge elephant that is moving forward. And we've spent a lot of time talking about the little rider guy who sort of got all the right ideas. Meanwhile, the elephant is doing what the elephant is going to do, and there's zero attention being paid to the fact that the elephant is probably of much more importance than whatever it is I'm thinking on a day-to-day basis.
yeah, and also if the elephant decides to go in a direction you don't really in
Right.
your head want it to go, there's not a whole lot you can do about it because the heart wants what the heart wants.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and and anybody who has ever struggled with their vices
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
knows that.
Right.
but there is this sense that that this affective domain has been greatly greatly ignored,
So how do you attend to the affective domain? I mean, like, again, just getting practical for us. I mean, how does one attend to that? How does one pay attention to that domain?
well, I think that you have to pay attention to uh, a real strong attention to the concept of beauty,
Mm,
broadly understood. I know this
mm,
is a big Bishop Barron thing. You know, you lead
yeah.
with beauty, and that has its limitations,
Hmm.
for sure. You also have to lead with the good and the true and those sorts of things. But you have to lead with the attractiveness of, like you
I was
said.
just going to say the word that keeps coming up is like, is it attractive? Like,
Yeah,
is,
yeah, you're only going to follow what it is you desire, and you're only going to
right.
desire something that seems attractive to you. And
Hmm.
if the form of religion that's being, go back to the conservative
Good,
evangelical,
good,
if the
good,
form
good. Yeah.
of religion that's being presented to you is that God is a great sadist in the sky who needed a pound of flesh from his son before he was going to forgive anybody, and unless you accept that death on the cross and your personal Lord and Savior, you're
Yeah.
going to suffer eternal perdition in
Yeah.
hell from this sadistic God where you just didn't check the right religion box
Right.
when you were choosing. And you know, that's not attractive. I'm sorry, that's not attractive.
Right.
Not to me, not to most people. And
Right.
there's a sort of Catholic version of that rising now too amongst
Totally.
traditionalists,
Totally. Totally.
unless
Totally.
we double down on eternal damnation and that
Hmm.
most people are on the broad path to perdition,
Hmm.
unless you double down on that, you're not going to motivate people to want to follow Christ. Well, newsflash, that's not going to motivate anybody. What has to be emphasized, you said, well, okay, what's going to make it attractive? Christ has to be presented as liberating.
Hmm.
It has to, that the
Hmm.
faith has to speak to my various forms of slaveries and addictions that
Yeah.
I know in my own heart and soul are holding me down and holding me back, but I don't know how to get out of them. I'm
Hmm.
just a man of my culture. My culture is creating these various enslavements and addictions, creating my depression and unhappiness, but I don't know that. So the evangelizing has to be tailored to flip that script, to help people to see with new spiritual eyes. Here is the liberation from that slavery and addiction that Christ brings. That was the message of the first few centuries of the church, where
Right.
those first the pagans viewed the supernatural domain as principalities and powers as these capricious and arbitrary gods that you had to please. And it was a fearsome realm. And
Right.
so along comes St. Paul and the other apostles and saying, no, Christ has slayed the dragon. He has killed those principalities and powers,
Right.
and now you are liberated into a new divine life. That was powerful to them. Now,
Yeah.
we're not pagans of that polytheistic brand
Hmm.
anymore, but there are principalities and powers in our secular domain that are idolatrous and enslaving, and we have to get people to see that. And a milquetoast Catholicism, either the right or the left, is not going to do that. It's simply going to double down on those strong gods.
That's right. Yeah, it's gonna it's not going to speak. You know, in another context, you and I had talked at great length about what we dubbed the ordo of apathy, and you know the simple fact remains is that 85% of those Catholics confirmed after the age of 21 no longer practice the faith. Well, why? Why do they no longer practice the faith? It seems to me that they no longer practice the faith because they simply don't see the good in it. They don't see the point.
No,
What's the point? There's no matter there. There's no reality there. It doesn't speak to them. And so who is that on? And that's on us.
yeah,
And look, and look, everybody has to be responsible for themselves, right? I mean, you can through sloth and and bad habit, you can habituate yourself to counterfeit lives, which is, I think, what we do. But still, like there has to be some reminder of what, quote unquote, the good news. So at the end of Douthat's piece here, he really talks about the fact that we are in this sort of era of decline. And, we used to spend our time looking for ways to re-evangelize those that had kind of fallen off. But he says, actually, there needs to be a dramatic renewal, require a dramatic religious change, mass conversions, he says. And so then we have to ask ourselves the question, like, what would that look like and how would that come about?
Yeah, the idea that we just need to get those fallen away Catholics to revert back to their faith through, Monte Carlo nights and free for raffles and stuff. It's just not going to work because the problem is they simply don't believe. They don't see
Yeah.
its connection to their life. So we do need a mass conversion event, but that's going to require a mass conversion event within the church itself.
Right. Right.
Okay, a complete sort of
Right.
change of direction. And this is why I think at the end of the day, of all, because we're running out of time, but the taxonomies that he gives, I'm definitely in Rod's camp of the Benedict option, with
Yep.
maybe a few caveats here and there of my own.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, we've lost the culture war. Rod is entirely correct about
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
we're not in the short term going to get these mass conversions unless the church herself converts, which
Right.
is going to require the development of small intentional I know that's a cliche, these
No, but he's
intentional
right. But you're
communities.
right.
And they have their dangers. They can become insular, they can become problematic in their own way, as anybody who's ever been involved in any of them can tell you. We're not talking utopia here. But the old Latin phrase, nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot give
What you
away
do not
what
have.
you do not possess.
Yeah.
And we don't right now possess the faith in any full sense. And we need to retreat, not run away, but to retreat into our own deep resources, reconfigure ourselves, repristinate. I love that word, to
Mm.
repristinate the
Yeah, I
faith,
like that too. I like
to
that too.
like scouring soot off of the Sistine Chapel to reveal the
Yeah.
colors below, underneath in their old vibrancy. We need to scrape away that varnish, that veneer of 2,000 years of garbage in order to sort of show again the full colors of not that the whole tradition is garbage, but I think
Yeah.
people understand what I'm saying. And that's what Rod's calling for. That's what the Benedict option is calling for. Let's witness to our faith and repristinate it and make it attractive again.
Right, and I think there may be a silver lining blessing in the falling off of respectability of the church. I mean, as the church becomes increasingly marginalized in mainstream Western culture, we are. I think Rod, with "Live Not by Lies" is pointing out something else. It's very, very true that we're going to be moving into increasing persecution, soft persecution, as Rod would call it. But there's a grace there because I think for too long, you talk about that mid-century cozy accommodationist position has basically been, look, it's okay to be kind of a bougie normie, and I think as I have said before on this podcast, it's vital that we Christians recognize that we just have to become more comfortable with being weird. As Ross quips in the piece, this emerging church is going to be by, of, and for weirdos, and we just have to be fully reconciled to the notion that we're going to be weirdos. And that's kind of okay. That doesn't mean weirdos can't be attractive and all that. But if you are looking to be respected in the halls of power, you're playing the wrong game. It's not 1987 anymore. And I think it's vital that that adults in our situations, in our positions, recognize like this is the score.
Yeah, and
This is where we are, and
I like that.
but I take that as like that's good. I think that's an opportunity for a kind of a renewal and a refounding. Like it's
Yeah,
okay not to be bothered by not being normal.
to be aware that, but also to understand, we're not talking here about a neo-bohemianism, running off to a commune so you can toke some weed
Yeah,
and talk deep thoughts, uh, because not being afraid to be weird is great as long as we understand that weirdness is probably going to lead to the cross.
sure.
And we need to constantly remind ourselves of that our existence as Christians is most likely going to be cruciform in our current situation, either a soft crucifixion,
Yeah,
a white martyrdom,
right.
or the burning down of churches in Canada.
Yeah, amen.
Instigated by Trudeau himself, who said, "Well, it's understandable."
Right.
That's outrageous.
Yeah, it
And
is outrageous.
that's where
And this is what Rod's constant refrain has been the last few months. Is like, look, he sees that "Live Not by Lies" is the opportunity for the church to prepare itself to suffer. Well, we're going to suffer, and we've got to kind of be okay with that. And again, it's not 1987, but we know. Look, we worship the God who is crucified, and therefore, why did you think that you were going to escape crucifixion? So at any rate, all right. Well, look, Larry, this has been awesome. As usual, we could go on for another couple of hours, but I've got a hard stop here. And look, thank you so much. I hope you can come back again and see us.
Oh, I'd love to. I love it, interviews with you, Kale. So you do such a great job. Thank you.
All right, man. Thank you so much. All right, everybody, don't get nothing on you. Bye.